So, welcome to the latest edition of Reviewing the Evidence. My name is Jack Borton and I'm a second year MSc Physiotherapy student from the University of Southampton. Now, this month's episode of the podcast is run slightly different to previous ones, as today it is your usual hosts, Chantal and Roslyn, that are in the hot seats as today's clinical experts. The aim of this podcast is to gain an insight into what being a clinical academic is all about. And to help us with this, we're going to critically analyse a paper published in the Journal of Clinical Nursing called Enablers and Barriers to Progressing a Clinical Academic Career in Nursing, Midwifery and Allied Health Professions, a cross-sectional study. Before we get into it, and to kick things off, could I just first both ask you to introduce yourselves, give a brief account of what you do in your role as a clinical academic, what it means to you, and why this episode may be of particular importance.
Shall I start? So I'm Chantal Osler. Obviously, I've been on the podcast many times before, but I probably haven't told people that much about actually what I do. So I'm a physiotherapist and I work at the Portsmouth Enablement Centre, which is the regional prosthetic service. And I lead the therapy team there in rehabilitation following lower limb amputation. But I also have worked for the University of Southampton and for the Trust doing research into prosthetic rehabilitation. And so being a clinical academic is brilliant. You get to have lots of opportunities to work on projects to improve things for our patients and improve our services and using really, really interesting methods. And this paper is particularly of interest to me because being a clinical academic is really hard in the trying to kind of work out what your job's going to look like and who's going to fund bits of it. And so I'm really interested to know what this group of people that have been down a similar path to me and what they've experienced.
Amazing.
And I'm Rosalind, again, similar to Chantal. I'm not an unusual face to be found on this podcast, but just to give a little bit more background on me, I am a specialist research nurse in cardiology as a clinician. And so what that means is my day-to-day work clinically is to support, advise, and run research studies within the cardiology department that range from emergency MIs and primary STEMIs or heart attacks, all the way to running outpatient clinics for people with chronic cardiology conditions. As a clinical academic, I work on my PhD, which is almost done. Woohoo! And like Chantal, I absolutely love being a clinical academic, and I love the balance that brings to how you see things and even to your own life. Last week, I actually did 5 days in a row of PhD, and it nearly killed me. So the thought of doing it full time is kind of just an interesting difference, a little bit of insight that I've had recently. And for me, similar to Chantal, this study is really important because it is one of the biggest things that nationally now has been recognized is that although the training pathways for clinical academics are excellent, when it comes to a career as a clinical academic, nurse, midwife, or allied health professional, we don't seem to have as many pathways. So I was really looking forward to seeing what other people said about it, what their experiences, and what those barriers and enablers looked like.
Nice, amazing. Okay, this is all about reviewing the evidence, this podcast. So we use critical appraisal tools. Could I just ask one of you to give a reason why we might use an appraisal tool to analyse a paper and how it can help researchers or students like myself to understand the paper a bit better?
So yeah, really a critical appraisal tool is really just a guide. And so you would, as we have been, select your critical appraisal tool based on the methods that they used in the paper. And then it literally just gives you a series of questions and helps to guide your critical thinking around what happened in the paper, whether it was the right thing that happened, whether we need to question it a little bit. But very much it just helps to guide you through the process. No, is there anything you want to add?
So I would say that's exactly right. But I think one of the things that has really been highlighted to me since I've started doing this podcast, and even through my PhD work, is the other thing that it really helps you do is it helps you look at the research in a different way. So instead of just reading the background information and the conclusions and coming up with your own decision, it really encourages you to delve into those harder bits of a paper to read. And that then really helps you understand better what they mean when they say, well, our research solved all the world's problems. It gives you that context, which really helps, for me anyway, increase my understanding.
Nice. I think I've got a little bit more practice of using appraisal tools, but I've certainly enjoyed doing this one. Before we get into it and start picking apart the paper a bit more, can I just get one of you to summarise the key findings of the paper?
Yeah, sure. So the aim of the study was to understand the routes through which nurses, midwives and AHPs pursue and then keep going a research career, and then what some of the enablers and barriers could be. And so they did an online questionnaire which addressed career choices, facilitators, barriers, and it was emailed to 1,074 past applicants to the NIHR doctoral and postdoctoral schemes. And it included people that were awarded the scheme and people that were rejected from the in the application process. And it was all done in England, and it was people between March and May in 2017. And although there were 1,074 people they emailed it out to, only 231 responded, which was a response rate of 25.6%. And so they found some really interesting stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about the sample in the question, so I won't go into too much detail about that. But some of the things that I thought were really interesting that they found were that AHPs often had earlier experiences with research than nurses or midwives, and often were experiencing that during their undergraduate career, whereas nurses were most commonly getting research experience when they participated in research delivery roles. So really different between those two groups. That those who were awarded fellowships were more likely to be research active, and that often following the fellowship, lots of people went back to their existing roles or ended up working in academia. So despite all that training and that investment, it wasn't easy to get a role in the NHS to be able to put that work into practice. And then they really talked about lots of kind of barriers and enablers. And some of those were things like inadequate support from employing organisations. Some of the facilitators were having availability of mentoring from other clinical academics. So loads of stuff that was really interesting, really resonated with kind of our experiences here at PHU, and which is particularly why we wanted to review this one. So I think we can talk a bit more about the methods as when we get to the critical appraisal.
Yeah. Okay. So the critical appraisal tool we are going to use is a tool from the Centre of Evidence-Based Management, and it's called Critical Appraisal of a Survey. Question number one is, did the study address a clearly focused question or issue?
So I'll jump in on this one. So my first gut reaction on it was no. But that was because their aims and objective in their abstract wasn't that clear. It was kind of, for me, it was a bit woolly. But when I kept reading, which is why you got to read more than the abstract, kids, actually, in their aim section of the paper, they did a really good job at much better clearly defining their three aims, and they were set out really well. So although I started with a no based on the abstract, that changed when I went into the meat of the paper. And I think it was a clearly focused question. And I was happy with it in general.
Okay. Do you think the aims and objectives were met and answered?
I think they were.
I would say so. I think to answer that, so why healthcare first got interested in an academic career, that one was answered. And then there is even a pretty graph to go with it, which is always a bonus. The career path that they pursue, again, it was there.
Yeah. And then probably not in as much detail.
Yeah.
And very NIHR focused, wasn't it? I mean, I think because we had a sample that mainly included, or at least half of them were applicants that were successful. it had lots of information about them, but it didn't necessarily talk about kind of the other routes that other people could have had in detail.
Exactly. So number 2 is a sort of.
Yeah.
And then number 3, the enablers and barriers. I think, they did a good job at describing how their sample felt about that.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a pretty graph as well. I like pretty graph.
Question number 2. Is the research method or study design appropriate for answering the research question?
So Rosalind's got can't tell, and I've got yes, but we actually were discussing this, weren't we, Jack, before, that a survey, you could absolutely use a survey to answer the questions that they had there. It wasn't that there was a huge mismatch in approaches. However, one of the things that I thought was that it was really, it could have been done using a more qualitative approach, so using focus groups or interviews. And so what we don't really know is how much existing research is out there that was looking at exploring these kind of issues, and whether perhaps a more in-depth kind of exploratory approach might have been better at the beginning, and then perhaps gone on to be investigated with a larger scale survey. But in essence, I felt that the aims that they set out it would match with a survey. So what do you think?
I agree. So the reason why I've selected I can't tell is because although the aims were well set out, the tool that they used was an adapted tool from a different environment. And although they made the links and stuff clear on it, they didn't. I found, like, especially around that aim number 2, the career pathways that they pursue, that link between the tool that they used, the conclusions that they drew, and the output and how they sampled, that became a bit muddier. And I just wondered whether or not, instead of using a tool that had been used in a different population with some slight adaptations, whether or not it would have been more beneficial to make it a bit broader if your secondary goal is to understand the career pathways that clinical academics pursue, then I would think, especially from all the clinical academics that I know, a survey probably isn't the best way to capture that.
You could have done some lovely qualitative work, kind of mapping with them and getting them to draw out their own career pathway. And I think you're completely right, because they're so varied. And so actually whether you can capture them within categories of a questionnaire would be difficult to tell. So
again, I don't have a problem with it. I just think maybe there was too many aims for a single paper. Maybe
single questionnaire.
Possibly.
Yeah. Did you have anything you wanted to add on that, Jack?
Only the fact that they've used a survey, and especially an online survey, does allow you to achieve a wide reach, doesn't it? But
and that's a really valid point, especially when you're looking at kind of the impact of like a national agenda, which was around the training of clinical academics. And the online survey is really, really useful, especially for clinicians that are busy. So I think that's a really important point. So
I didn't think of that. Well done, Jack.
Okay. Question number 3 of the critical appraisal survey. Is the method of selection of subjects clearly described?
So they talk about who they are going to sample from, the population they're sampling from. So they say that it is NIHR past applicants for their doctoral and postdoctoral level schemes, and it's between 2008 and 2016, and that's about it, isn't it? So and they, in order to identify them, to get the surveys out to them, they used email addresses that they had historically held for those past applicants. But actually they raised that as a limitation, didn't they? Which is a very relevant limitation, was that some of those past applicants would have been back from 2008 and they don't update those email addresses. So whether that contributed to the response rate or contributed to the sample in any way, that could have had an impact. But I suppose the important thing that they talked about was that those participants formed a convenient sample. So the sampling approach that they took was just anyone who responded, they were going to include in their study. And that's quite a common approach, isn't it?
Yeah. I would say, like, there's, from my point of view, considering it was a convenience sample, there wasn't really any overt issues I had with how they described the methods to which they were trying to get people. So yeah, I didn't have any major issues or concerns there.
Yeah.
So the method of selection is clearly described, and we've almost touched on it a little bit on question number 4, but I'll ask it to leave it open and to answer as well. Do you think the way that the sample is obtained will introduce any selection bias? So we've already said A, it's a convenience sample. Anything else that could be raised about introducing bias?
Go on, Jack. You have a go.
I did. There was one thing that I had. The fact that they only included past applicants between 2008 and 2016. The program is still running, and it is still running now. But in 2015, it changed. So it changed in 2015 to a new program called ICA. I cannot remember what that stands for. Can anyone help me out?
It's the Integrated Clinical Academic Training Program. Yeah. Which is the one that is currently still running.
So the fact that they've only that was opened in 2015 and they only recruited participants up to 2016 leaves it. There's a small window where they could only recruit participants on the new program. So potentially that will influence the results.
And anyone who was feeding back was still in the middle of that program. So basically, when they looked at the postdoc experiences, they would have been on the past program. So so that absolutely could have introduced bias. Yeah.
Really good catch, Dad. I didn't catch that. For me, I think one of the things that I found really, really strong about the bias selection is that, well, yes, it was a convenient sample, the response rate was terrible.
Yeah.
Like, and I mean, response rates can be bad, and I think I'm going to clarify that. So most of the surveys I'm more familiar with are in a patient population, not in a workforce population. So it could be in a workforce population, this is actually an excellent response rate, but I don't have that perspective. So in heart failure patients, a good response rate or average sort of response rate is somewhere between 60 and 70-ish% kind of thing. And so for me, 25% is quite a lot lower than what my patients responded. So that kind of made me go, But then the other really thing that I found very interesting is because in their aims, they didn't specify that they were going to focus exclusively on NIHR funded fellowships. However, in their method section, although they had a considerable amount of, so what it was 25% of 80, so it's about 20 to 40 more participants, 20-ish odd participants who responded to the survey that were excluded.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't reported in this paper, and those individuals were people who were funded outside of the NIHR. So, and they don't really talk about why.
Yeah, and it doesn't, and their aims don't say that they're explicitly evaluating the NIHR program.
Yeah.
So you think it would be completely valid to include those people?
Yeah, and so for me, that just, again, I've written on the side of mine, I'm like, why?
Yeah.
Why? Like, if the aim of the research was global, and anybody in the UK who is a clinical academic, even if they wanted to just in this paper focus on the NIHR fellowship process, then to me they should have declared that, and possibly in their other reports the whole sample is there, but in this paper they didn't say we're going to focus only on the NIHR pathway. They just gave one little sentence that says we didn't include them in this report.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I was really thinking about was that what we really have no idea is how well this sample represents the full population.
Yeah.
And so it's really unclear as to whether it's the same, like males versus females. So you've got quite a few females in this study, but if the actual population had less females, then you're going to get that female bias. And we know that women have a more fragmented career pathway, broken up by maternity leave, issues with part-time working. And so you could get a very different experience if you had a female heavy sample. And the other thing that we do know is that in the conclusion, it says that there were 225 funded clinical academic fellowships since the scheme was started. So that is a funded, if we look at our full sample, our full population, which was 1,074, we've got about a quarter of our full population that have been awarded.
Yeah.
If you look at the awarded versus non-awarded in the sample, it's closer to 50% awarded. So your sample is over-sampled awarded participants compared to your population, which means that it's much more likely that you're going to get bias associated with people that are on NIHR awards who are likely to be much more supported, have proper bought out time to do their work. So if it was more representative of the population, you may find that actually some of the issues raised here were raised in a much stronger way with much higher frequencies than they are actually presented. So I think what we can say is that that there could absolutely be bias in the sample. We know of one bias, which is this award versus non-award bias, but because we don't understand the full population, the rest of these biases are unknown, but we're pretty sure that they're in there. So.
And when you're describing the bias about the full population, are you referring to the fact that they've got demographics for the sample, but they haven't stated any demographics for the actual population?
Yeah, and they might not have them. So it might be that the NHR don't have that kind of information, and we don't know what the demographics are of the full population. And to a certain extent, in their limitations, they do talk a little bit about that. And so that's really good if they're raising it in the limitations themselves. And that's absolutely fine. Then you as the reader can think, oh, okay, I need to take care of that. What's not so good is if there are overt limitations that are then not discussed by the authors themselves. And so they do touch on it there to say that that it focuses on NHR funding, it doesn't consider other funding, but they don't go into detail to say actually they have definitely oversampled people that have been awarded.
Really good point.
Moving on, I think we may have touched on question number 5 already or answered it. So if anyone hasn't got anything to say, I'll skip over it. But was the sample of subjects representative with regard to the population to which the findings will be referred?
What do you think, Jack?
I'm going to say can't tell.
Yeah.
That's
right
answer.
Yeah, we just don't know.
But
just checking my notes.
What Chantal raised is a really interesting point, is just because we can't tell doesn't mean that this paper isn't good, because what we don't know is actually, does anybody know what this population looks like? Has anybody actually ever, and I think they've recently tried to do one. So a couple of months ago, there was a big Twitter campaign trying to get people to talk about and record those sorts of factors. So I think we may not know. So that limitation and us not being able to do that might actually be a function of a new research question that needs doing, rather than this paper is no good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Question number 6 is, was the sample based on pre-study considerations of statistical power? My question here is, there is no talk of power calculation, but do we need one?
That's a very good question, Jack. So, power calculations, to those who aren't familiar with statistics, is basically there's multiple different formulas depending on what statistical test you want to use, that you can plug some factors in. So things like a survey response rate, for example, which then a bunch of fancy math happens and you get an estimated sample size, how many people you should approach and then likely what your outcome of that would be. So for example, if we knew, and we did, because the medics also had a very poor response rate to this similar survey, and if you then knew, in order to make a comparison between, say, the medics answers and then this paper's answers, whether or not there was any difference, that you would need a certain number of participants, then you would have had a goal that said, okay, if we know only 25% are going to respond and we need 400 people in order to make this comparison, then we're going to actually have to approach 5,000 people in order to get that. So that's kind of what a power calculation is about. It's basically a educated, rough estimate on how many people you approach, so you get the right amount of people in your sample in order to do the statistical test that you want to do in order to answer your question. And what Chantal just said there, which I've been trying to avoid using the word for all the statistical people who are not used to it, is it's called inferential. So there's descriptive statistics, which basically says how many boys, how many girls,
which is what this paper has
done. And then there's inferential statistics, which says, are the boys different than the girls?
Yeah.
Or do the boys and girls responses have any sort of a relationship? So I think for me in this study, you're right, there was no mention to it, but I don't know, based on their aims, I don't believe that it was needed.
Yeah, it's much more of a descriptive style study, isn't it? So yeah.
Okay. Question number 7, which we have answered already, but I'm going to tailor it slightly, is, was a satisfactory response rate achieved? It's a 25.6% response rate, which is pretty low to not good. But my question is, why was the response rate so low? What was it about the methods that resulted in the response rate being so low?
Jack, if you're going to ask us questions like that, you can answer them. What do you think?
I think it sent over. So they sent an initial email, and this was to the old email. This is to email addresses of people they had. So there's a chance that people have changed their email addresses, they've changed careers, so automatically that may change anyway. They have sent a follow-up email, which is a good. 3 weeks later, they sent a follow-up email, which is good. But if someone emails me a questionnaire, am I likely to complete it? I don't know.
Depends on whether you see value, doesn't it, in that questionnaire. But I think the thing that you tapped into, actually, that's probably one of the biggest contributors to their low response rates, is the thing that you said at the beginning, was that they were using email addresses that they didn't know if they were up to date. And so they had no idea whether all of those were getting through. So
they did, however, clarify that they didn't have any bounces.
Yeah. Okay.
So that then, if they don't say it in so many words, but that then makes me assume then that for whatever reason, those email addresses were active.
Yeah.
Now, just because you have an active email doesn't mean you check that email.
Yeah.
Because if it was an email that was associated with a university that you're not there anymore, and that university's IT department didn't shut it down,
or even NHS IT department,
whatever. So I think for me, that again was one thing that I would have been more interested to hear their thoughts on, why that response rate, they believed it to be so low. In exactly trying to understand, was it because you weren't using the right emails? Did you even care? Did you even look? Like things like that. Seeing as you answered that so well, I have another question for you, John.
Watch out.
Is, as a clinician, if you were being approached for a survey study like this and it came in your email, what are things that as a researcher we could do to make you more likely to complete it? Just out of curiosity.
And just your personal thoughts.
Yeah,
what would
personal
make
thoughts.
I think if you have an invested interest in something, you're going to answer it.
Yeah.
So if you send me an email and about a survey about why I want to become a clinical academic, I might answer it. But yeah, if you sent me an email about something else that I'm not interested in, so I suppose that there's an invested interest bias in that. Yeah, can you go around offering incentives? I don't know.
The thing for me, and that always dictates whether I'm going to do it or not, is if they tell me how much time it's going to take me.
Okay. Yeah.
Because if they don't tell me how much time it's going to take me, then I wouldn't even start it, because I could be starting an hour-long questionnaire and then not find I've got time to finish it. So if they say to me this will take you 10 minutes or 30 minutes, then I'll always have a go at it. Because then even if I have to block out time in my diary to do that 30 minutes, I also think that I'll probably do it quicker than 30 minutes. Because I'm not very thorough. So.
Challenge accepted.
I'm like, but yeah, time, how long it's going to take me is the big thing that motivates me or not to take off.
Yeah, it's interesting to think that, because I think I probably err a little bit more on your side, Jack, where for me it's about value and do I have anything I want to say to be heard? Because, you know, possibly those non-responders are people who their pathway was completely enabled. They had no issue with it whatsoever. And so they saw this survey and they're like, well, why would I answer that? Because it was so easy.
Bearing in mind they've oversampled successful applicants.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Exactly. So that could actually be another really big form of bias that we're not really aware of. Because you can't tell. That's the problem. You're not able to tell why the people who said no said no.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thank you for putting me on the hot seat. Question number 8. Are the measurements likely to be valid and reliable? So is the questionnaire likely to be valid and reliable?
So they have the questionnaire available for us to look at in a supplementary file, which is a really good thing, so that we can actually go back and see what the questionnaire looked like and what was part of it. I suppose the thing that I would have liked to have seen more information about was how they developed the questionnaire. And so what they did tell us is it was based on a previous questionnaire, which was called the Industrial Facts and Forecasts Research from the Medical Research Council, which was, and we've gone back and looked it up, and that was looking at a similar project. But even I think when you guys looked through that, it wasn't entirely clear how they chose the questions that made up the questionnaire. And so, you know, there are a number of different ways that you might make up questions in a questionnaire. I mean, some people could just, they could just come out of one individual's head and what they thought was there. But a more rigorous way might be to look through the current evidence. So to do a systematic review or a literature review or even some kind of qualitative synthesis, looking at what people had already raised in the previous literature as important things to include in your questionnaire. Or you could take a more empirical based research approach to it and do some focus groups or some interviews with a little group of people that you would target in your questionnaire and use that information to help inform the questions you put in your questionnaire. Because obviously, if you don't develop that questionnaire in a rigorous way, how do you know that the questions that you've asked in that questionnaire are the important questions? And so what they've said here is that they've pre-tested with 5 past applicants, but what we don't know with that pre-test is that, are they looking at content and getting advice on the content of the questionnaire, or are they just looking at the usability, the accessibility, the language, how readable it is, whether it it flows well on the screen, that kind of thing. And so they don't give us any information about that. So I think from my point of view, to understand whether the questionnaire was valid, i.e. it was capturing what it wanted to capture and was reliable, would have known a bit more about the development of that questionnaire. I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
So I find it so fascinating. So, and again, for people who don't know us out there, Chantal is very much more into qualitative research, and like that's her bread and butter, and she loves it and she's amazing at it and things like that. I'm more new to that type of research, so using words versus numbers to kind of unpick something. And I 100% agree with all of your points, and I think they're really important, and that would have added a lot of value in this study. However, This is technically a much more heavily weighted quantitative, so number study. So when I read the terms valid and reliable, those are specific statistical tests that you perform on a survey in order to determine, does this actually measure what you think it's measuring? Or did your respondent, read the question, is the sky blue? And to them, that was like, oh, did you mean the painting on my wall has a blue sky? The answer is no, because it's green, because it's impressionist, versus does it mathematically capture what you think it's capturing? And then reliability is, does that do it in a reliable way? So if you do it on a Tuesday versus a Wednesday, if you do it with a boy versus a girl, and those are specific tests that get run on a survey, and none of that was there. But again, I don't know how appropriate that was, because this is, as far as I'm aware, this was the first time that any of this was ever done, and it was more about trying to describe it and to identify factors that either enable or formed a barrier to it, as well as sort of getting a handle on who this group of people are. So
yeah,
it's interesting, because I now, after doing my PhD, would be much more in Chantel's, for this level of study where it's at, I think, to inform reliability and validity, I'd probably change the terms of it so that our positivist friends don't think about numbers, but that there needed a bit more work under, why did you ask those questions? Why were they important to help form an opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. In sticking with the theme of statistics, question number 9 is, was the statistical significance assessed?
So I'm going to group question 9 and group question 10 together, because they kind of go hand in hand. And the simple answer is no. But the also simple answer is similar to how other questions we've talked about with this specific study is, I don't strongly feel that any, like, those statistical significance being assessed or confidence interval was appropriate for what they were trying to do.
Yeah.
So for me, those answers actually, instead of being a no, really should be a not applicable.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
And actually, Jack, one of the things that we talked about earlier was about that question 9, just assumes that all of the data that you're going to get from a survey is quantitative. And actually, this survey had quite a lot. We thought it has 3 big kind of open-ended free text questions at the end. And so maybe whether the question in here in the critical appraisal tool would be, is the analysis done appropriate? Have they taken the right analysis for the data collected within the survey?
Yeah.
And so in this survey, they chose descriptive analysis, which was absolutely appropriate for the data that they're collecting. But they also talked about doing thematic analysis, and they were going to do that on the free text. So, Jack, did you have any thoughts on on what they talked about with their thematic analysis?
Yeah, so for the readers, this is on the final paragraph of the results, or the penultimate paragraph of the results. And they say most participants, in the thematic analysis part, they say most participants provided further comment about clinical academic careers. Of these, around 10% described being positive, grateful, and thankful for the award, expressed the importance or value for the need of clinical academic roles in the NHS. So they've stated they've done a thematic analysis, and they've given a brief summary of what the findings were, but they haven't gone into too much of detail about it. Normally, if I was to see a thematic analysis, I would expect to see quotations. There's no quotations. It's fairly brief. What does the results mean? What are they presenting them for? They haven't done anything with the data as such.
Yeah, that's completely right. They've almost just kind of given a list of the things that came up in those free texts without anything to help to back them up, to show some quotes, without any attempt to try and to give any explanation around them. But also in their methods, they almost kind of just sort of throw in like about 2 sentences about thematic analysis. So So they didn't really, they said they were going to do it, but it was almost a bit of an afterthought, a bit like, what are we going to do with our free text info at the end?
What I would be quite curious about, because this has been out now for a year, whether or not there's a partner paper
Okay.
to it. So it could be that their ultimate goal was to do more of a mixed methods approach, and that they purposely have only briefly described the more qualitative research that they did on this subject, which would be great. However, they didn't tell us that.
Yeah. We were just, me and Jack were talking about this earlier, and I was thinking, when I'm writing papers at the moment, the more of these we're critiquing, the more it makes me think, like, there are certain sentences you just have to put in, and you just have to say, like, why did I do this? Why did I not do that? Things, and otherwise, your paper's just going to get pulled apart once we start going through some of these. It's going to get pulled apart anyway. That was a load of rubbish. So, sorry, carry on, Jack.
No, I'll apologise to the writers of this paper. I certainly can do a job as good as they've done, so we don't need to pull it apart too much. Okay. Question number 11. So we've done 9 and 10. Question number 11 is: could there be any confounding factors that haven't been accounted for?
Yeah, I mean, we just don't know, and we know that they've oversampled people on programs, and so people that are on NHR programs, their experiences are likely to be different to people that aren't, and therefore that may have confounded the findings. But there are other biases that we don't know if they're there, we don't know if they're not there, and so all we can say is it's unknown whether there are any confounding factors.
For me, one of the biggest possible confounding factors that I think it goes back to the conversation we were having around this validity and reliability, is because we don't know whether or not this tool is actually capturing what people want to talk about and what actually were the issues for this population. Because we don't know how well informed those questions were, we don't know. Like, although this is a very well written paper, it reports on the data very, very well, and I could like it very much, and like my notes are basically scribbling all over it from my own personal perspective and how this relates to me and my career and my life as a clinical academic. What we don't know is, in this population, are there questions that this population are dying to answer that just haven't been asked, and that those answers then present a confounding factor, and we just don't know.
I think what this paper does do a good job is highlighting its limitations.
Yes,
it does.
They know its limitations.
Yeah, I don't think it captures all of them, so it doesn't capture everything that we spoke about, but it does touch on quite a few of the things we've talked about. So it talks about the response rate was low. It talks about the email addresses being old. It talks about that it focuses on the NHR, and that's not the only pathway. And it talks about the limitations of the recency of the program that we highlighted. So I completely agree with you, Jack. I think they did a nice job with their limitations.
Okay, and this is the final question of the appraisal tool. Doesn't mean I'm going to not ask any more questions, but can the results be applied to your organisation?
So I think in all, I think that what this study gives us is an interesting insight into the experiences of people that have been on these programs or have applied for these programs. I think because we don't understand where the biases are in terms of the sample that they used, I think we always have to have an element of caution when and we can't take it as fact that this is what it will be like for everybody, and that something hasn't been missed. And again, the authors do say that this may not include all of the insights, but I think that actually a lot of the things that they're talking about in this paper really resonate with my own experiences. And so I think where I can personally kind of see some of the challenges of getting onto these programs, the routes that people talk about, like myself, my experience through research came as an undergraduate when I did my physio degree, but then I also did my master's, so I did research then, but then I also did a research delivery role. And so then you can, those are the kind of pathways that they're very much describing. but also the challenges that both of us are absolutely facing. And that part of why we're in post is to think about actually what happens postdoctorally, and how we want to make sure we don't lose people that the trust may have invested in, or the National Institute for Health Research have invested in. We don't want to lose them postdoc, and how do we help to kind of shore up those pathways so people don't fall off the cliff?
Yeah. I completely agree. And I think for me as well, like if you're talking about applicability, and I think like this tool was more designed more around like probably like a clinical or interventional or something like that. But for me, being a clinical academic, I've got it highlighted and I've said beside it that for me, the actual applicability to me has really resonated, because I'm not on this lovely NIHR pathway. I don't know what my future yet holds. And so I kind of fall in between the bias we've already spoken about in this study of people who are successfully fellowshipped and whatnot, and these people who are rejected. I'm in between there. And I think for me, that final, like the sentence in the paragraph that and the conclusion that says the lack of a formal career structure for those with research training in clinical practice leaves many having to find their own way, often with little support from employers and frequently with nowhere else to go but previous jobs. To me, it normalizes my experience, but it also helps, like when I put that, our new critical sort of framework that we built around this study, that we know that is true in the people who are on the shiny pathway.
Yeah.
It makes me feel less like
you've missed out on something.
I've missed out on something, that actually, even if I was on that thing, that I'd still have struggles, and that actually it's a recognition that has evidence behind it, that what we do as clinical academics is hard, and not just that the research and doing a PhD is hard, but that forging a new pathway and a new way of doing research in the NHS is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And that just makes me feel a bit like, oh, it's not just me.
I think thinking about that comparison to pathway and non-pathway through the NHR makes you realise that it's not necessarily an individual thing, it's a system thing.
Exactly.
It's the way that this training sits within these kind of non-existent career pathways, and that there's lots of investment on training, but then where do you go when you're trained? What do you do when you're trained? And that's not a unique experience. It's something that's being felt on formalised pathways and non-formalised pathways all over the country.
Exactly.
So, and it's something that we here at PHU are really committed to try and resolve. And that's part of kind of what we're working on as our roles at the moment. So
nice. Okay, good. Just I'm going to ask a couple of questions in order to provide a summary to the listeners. Was this an appropriate critical appraisal tool to be used to analyse this paper?
So for me, I hate critical appraisal tools. I mean, I'm going to share that with the world, because I just find like that there's usually one or 2 points that they miss. Things I loved about this one was it was simple.
Yeah, look at right. If you haven't downloaded it, look at that.
It's one.
Look at the little table.
Oh,
it's lovely.
It's beautiful. It's one little bit. It's one page. It's yes, can't tell, no. You don't have to wax on poetical about why it is yes or no. And I would say, from my knowledge of what makes a good survey, actually they hit the vast majority of those points.
Yeah.
So I really liked it as a tool. I don't tell anybody.
And I always love it when they've got that last question. Can the results be applied to your organisation? Yeah. Such an important question, and quite a few of the ones we've looked at recently have had that nice kind of application at the end of them. So
I also felt as well that this is actually a really easy to use tool for people who are not as familiar with research. It wasn't full of a lot of terms that were really hard to understand. And so I think from my point of view, so far out of the tools that we've used, this is my new favorite.
Yeah, I think it's nice. And yeah, I think the only downside that I would say is that some of the other tools, that if there's a term in there, they then give you a bit of information underneath about what it might mean.
Especially on that statistical stuff.
Whereas they don't, this one doesn't do that. However, we are all friends with Google, so we can all look it up. And we should be looking things up. So I wouldn't say that was a kind of a something that would make me chuck it in the bin.
Okay, cool. And then one last question. If the authors were to repeat this study, how could they improve it?
So I suppose from my point of view, I'd like to know more about the target population, but I also appreciate that that information is not available. But I think understanding how well the sample represents that target population would help us to understand the question of bias. The other thing that I would like to know a bit more about would be the development of the questionnaire. So, and again, just like, they don't have to go back and redo it or anything, just to tell us a bit more about how they did it. So
I agree. And the other thing that I think I would change if I was doing this again is an online survey. Why didn't they utilize social media? Especially if they got so many months in and they saw that their response rate was so low.
Yeah.
Why didn't they make an appeal using hashtags, using their networks?
Yeah.
Getting professional institutions to promote this. Getting the alumni foundations in the university to promote it. It seemed to me like there were lots of ways they could have increase the sample size. They weren't utilized without spending that much money or effort.
That's a really good point.
Twitter's amazeballs.
A little effort there.
Would you on that one, would you have to send a revision to the ethics board in order to approve that?
It would be easy. Quite a minor amendment, and they can go through quite quickly.
It wouldn't represent a huge amount of work to get it out there on social media or to recruit. I think they call it gatekeepers.
I suppose the one thing by going out onto social media like that is you'd need some way then of screening whether they were past applicants or current applicants. That would be anything, wouldn't it?
But then again, you got
you got the population
as well.
Look at us getting all excited.
Because then you could actually have two different arms. You could have the population. You could, it'd be amazeballs.
Okay. Has anyone got any final points before I wrap up?
No, I think that was really good. Thank you so much for doing
well done, Jack. Student round of applause. And so just for everyone, Jack is currently my clinical academic student. And so I'd absolutely encourage anybody who's working in clinical academic roles to try and have a clinical academic student, because it's really good fun. And we also, on our podcast, on the clinical academic webpage, there is also a specific podcast about clinical academic student placement. So you can check that one out.
Yeah, and I've not come to the end of my placement yet, but I've certainly had a fantastic experience. So thank you to Chantel and everyone that's been involved. And thank you to you listeners for joining us today for this podcast. I hope you've enjoyed the critical appraisal of this paper, and that you will join us for next month's podcast.
I haven't got a clue what it is. I'm really sorry. It's the next month's educational hot topic. So whatever that is, that's what we'll be talking about.
Keep an eye out, because it will be on the website. And all the details for the Clinical Academic Hub, the clinical academics that are here today, will be in the information below the video. And if you'd like any further information about doing a clinical academic career or how to begin your research journey, then please get in touch.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.